Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the South-South Dialogue on Sustainability lecture series on African people's struggles for liberation. Today we have lecture 3. It is co-organized by Global University for Sustainability, Lingnan University, Daraja Press, Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives, and Green Guan Eco Tech Center. My name is Tsui, Jade, Margaret, a founding member of Global University for Sustainability. We provide English, French, Chinese, simultaneous interpretation. You can choose the interpretation at the bottom of your computer screen. We would like to thank today's interpreters, Sandri Alonji and Maria de Pasia, Huang Xiaomei and Li Monghong. Apart from Zoom webinar, we are also doing live streaming at Bilibili, which is a very popular social media platform in China. There are thousands of young fellows who are interested in world politics and eager to learn from alternative thoughts and experience. Let me first introduce the co-moderator, Dr. Firoze Manji. Dr. Firoze Manji is the course director. He is adjunct professor in the Institute of African Studies at Carleton University, Ottawa in Canada. He is also the director of Daraja Press, a publisher that nurtures reflections, shelters hopes, and inspires audacity. Now I pass the floor to Dr. Manji. Thank you.
Thank you, Jade. And first of all, I'd just like to express my thanks to the institutions involved, but in particular, Jade and Kinchi Lau and her colleagues, as well as our interpreters who've just done a fantastic job so far. So thank you so much. Today we are we're having two really important presentations. The first presentation, I think, is very timely in a situation where I think there has been an insufficient appreciation for many of us of the way in which money, control of the monetary system is at the heart of the colonial and neo-colonial control and domination. And two of the people who have done an extraordinary piece of work in analyzing and enabling people to understand it are our first presenters today. I'm very pleased to welcome Fanny Pigeaud, who's a French journalist who has been working on France-Africa relations for more than 20 years. She has spent a lot of time in Africa, in Cameroon and Gabon, as well as in the Ivory Coast. And she's the author of a number of books, including A Decade of Cameroon. And she's co-author with Ndongo Samba Sylla of Africa's Last Colonial Currency, the CFA Franc Story. I wonder if it's the last colonial currency or whether the dollar continues to be the current colonial currency, but we'll discuss that in good time. Our co-speaker is Dr. Ndongo Samba Sylla, who's a Senegalese development economist, one of the greatest thinkers, economic thinkers, as well as political thinkers on the continent, in my opinion. He has previously worked as technical advisor at the Presidency of the Republic of Senegal, and he is currently the senior research and program manager at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation West Africa office, based in Dakar. He is, as I said, a co-author with Fanny Pigeaud of the Africa's Last Colonial Currency, and he's also the co-founder of a very important network that is emerging called CORA, the Collective for the Renewal of Africa. A warm welcome to you, Fanny and Ndongo. And we look forward to learning from you about monetary imperialism, in particular the case of CFA in West Africa. A warm welcome.
Merci Firoze, merci.
Thank you, Firoze. Thank you for inviting me. We are very happy with Ndongo to talk about this currency. It's very specific, very special, as you will see. We will talk about the CFA. CFA is an acronym of two currencies, actually, that are being used by 14 African countries, sub-Saharan countries, not just West Africa, but also Central Africa. 8 are in West Africa. You have Benin, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo. And we have 6 more in Central Africa: Cameroon, Congo, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, Central African Republic, and Chad. CFA franc has a very specific history with no equivalent, I think. And now we'll let the floor to Ndongo to go back to the history and the beginning of CFA. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you today here and to talk about this currency, CFA franc. Like just said Fanny, the CFA franc is actually an acronym referencing to 2 different currencies. At the beginning, when this currency was created in 1945, at the end of World War II, CFA was born from a devaluation of the franc in metropole in France for the major part of the colonial empire of France in Africa and other places. After World War II, the French economy was really weak. They were facing several countries, for example, importation, facing inflation that was really huge, especially in the metropole, higher than in the colonies. So one of the decisions that was taken was to know if they should have the same devaluation rate for the whole colonial empire to keep this monetary stability. So the stability to have a currency empire, to see if they should have different rate devaluation. So the consequences were terrible. The inflation was really huge in the metropole. So secretly, they took a decision to have devaluation rates that were different in the metropole and in the colonies. So this is when the currency was created, the CFA franc, 26 December of 1945, declared as a new currency. And at the time, the CFA meant franc of the French colonies in Africa. This currency was used in the sub-Saharan part of the French Empire. So this was the context for the creation of the empire and the creation of this currency. And when it was declared to the International Monetary Fund, it was declared with a very strong and shocking difference, because the CFA was exchanged against 1.70 franc, and later it was exchanged against 2.7 franc. So we do not have the same context, for example, for England and with its English colonies. In this case, the parity was really more conform to the economic development we had at the time. But France decided to have a higher difference between these two currencies in order to gain more opportunities, market opportunities after the war, because during the war, we had very weak exchanges between the metropole and the colonies. So the colonies started to have more exchanges with other parts of the world, like Asia, Africa, Southern America. So the metropole was losing money. So they had to obtain again to gain these opportunities. So with this creation of the CFA, with evaluation, they could reinforce their place for importation. So the objective was to be more competitive and to have a captive part of the market. Also, an over-evaluated currency is very useful for exportation from Africa. The African colonies were not competitive anymore. So the idea was for their clients to turn themselves to the metropole and not anymore to the colonies. So this is the context in which CFA was created and which participated to the creation of the French economy, which was very weakened after World War II. So in 1960, the majority of the countries that were colonized by France in sub-Saharan Africa became independent from France. But it was not very ordinary way, because the monetary colonial empire of France was still here. For example, for other colonial empires, for example, for the English one, the pound, the sterling pound, was devaluated because the countries decided to create their own money. It was the same for the Belgian Empire, Portuguese Empire, Spanish Empire, etc. But France managed to have this monetary empire with the CFA franc. How? Well, it happened in several steps. First, French managed to keep its old colonies under its control. I think we can come back for the slides. Yes, thank you. Just one before, maybe. So actually, France was organized to keep the control of its former colonies, even though it was independent formally. So first, France chose the leaders that were in charge of these countries. France chose them through different methods. For example, it eliminated physically some opponents, like in Cameroon. It also organized several cheated elections in a lot of territories that was under its administration. So it selected leaders that were favorable in favor of France. It also signed some agreements, which were called cooperation agreements for several sectors: defense, foreign affairs, raw materials, currency management. And doing so, France had an objective, was to keep on having access to raw material at a lower price and to have opportunities for these companies and to keep having opportunities on the African market in these new states. And also it still had a control on the political and economical life in these countries. Thanks to these cooperation agreements, it managed to still have military bases on the continent still here today, and it also managed to impose the use of the CFA franc with this area of CFA. And still today, it's the French Ministry of Currency, of Finance, that is in control of this currency. I also need to precise that European Union today has a role to play, because in 1999 we had a change in Europe with the creation of the euro, and at this time France had to give up on a small part of its sovereignty on the CFA franc. The French government really fought to keep having this power on this area against the opinion of some of these European countries, for example, Germany. But eventually, French still managed to keep the control of this area, this franc area, accepting that monetary politics of the Eurozone had they were to say on this management of the CFI. And today France have to inform the Financial and Economical Committee of Europe to inform them every time there is a change for the CFI regarding the euro, and also in case a new member would like to be part of CFA area. So today we can talk about a euro CFA franc. This currency depends on France and on European Union. If you look at this slide, on the next slide, we have a drawing, a cartoon, and you see that underwater, the two boats are still linked one to each other. So it's a cartoon from an Ivorian journalist. So we see that on surface, the rope is cut, but underwater, we still have one cord, one rope. It's the CFA, which is also the military power, because as I told you, there is a military base in Africa. Now I'll give the floor to Bongo that will talk about the functioning of this CFA franc. So the CFA franc system, so like we said, we have two monetary unions. So the first one is of the Western Africa. So we have 8 countries. You can see it's in yellow. These 8 countries share one CFA that we call the CFA franc of the Financial Economic Union of West Africa. So this CFA is different from the CFA we can find in Central Africa, which is the French of the Economic and Monetary Cooperation of CFA franc. So both this zone has its own franc, its own central bank. So for Western Africa, we have the Economic and Monetary Union of West Africa and the Central Bank of West Africa states. So even though these two CFA are different, they still share the same principles of functioning coming from the colonial era. So they work exactly the same way they did at the colonial time. Next slide, please. Okay. So from 1945 to nowadays, the CFI system rested on 3 main pillars and 2 counterparts. So the first one is what we call the fixed peg of the franc regarding the French currency. So it was the franc before until 1999, and since then it is euro. So why fixed peg? Because it allowed the franc to have a stability without any change. So the CFA value in euro won't change. It will remain. This way, when French multinationals want to change for money, they won't have any problem. Second principle, free transferability. It means that we have a freedom of movement of capitals and income between each countries or blocks and with France. So they can take back all the benefits. A third pillar is convertibility guaranteed by the French Treasury. What does it mean? Well, it means that the French Treasury guarantees that it can allow every central bank, for example, for the Western bank, if they do not have enough euros or dollar, they can accept an overdraft. So French bank will give it and allow it to have more money. but actually it was never activated because rules were implemented for the Treasury, for the French Treasury, do not have to give money to give euros to these central banks. So these principles has two counterparts. The first one is that each one of the central bank has to make a deposit to the French Treasury. So they receive the money in the French Treasury. So at the time of independence, it was 100%. In the mid-90s, mid-70s, it was a bit less, like 60, 70%. And since the mid-20s, it's 50%. So 50% of their rate change is deposited in the French Treasury. For example, if Gabon exports petrol, it has to give half of its dollars to the French Treasury. And of course, for the exportation, they will receive a counterpart. Second counterpart is that the French government is represented in the organs of both central banks with an implicit veto power. Before it was written down in the statutes, but today it is said that all major decisions have to be accepted by this represented. And since the creation of euros, CFA became a currency under double tutelage of the French Treasury and of the political and monetary authorities of Eurozone. Next slide, please.
Next slide, please. Okay. Et donc, la spécificité un peu
So the specificity of the CFA franc is what we call the operations account. So I explain it a bit that if we consider that the French Treasury is open in both books of the both central banks, where they have to make a deposit, like I said, 100% until mid-70s and 50% since the 2000s. So the French Treasury established laws that every time we have a possibility to have the reserves to be emptied, the Treasury will ask to implement a new monetary law and to ask to FME to for them to get a loan, to get money. This is how pretty much this system works. So we have this guarantee that does not exist, but actually is the main argument that justifies that France is involved in economical and monetary affairs of its former colonies, because they say, I am playing the role of a guarantee, but actually we do not have this guarantee. Next slide, please.
Je vais revenir sur cette
I come back on this guarantee. To insist on it, this is the main argument used by French authorities until today to justify actually the fact that it is still France that is commanding, that is managing the CFA. We had two periods when this guarantee should have been obtained. For example, at the beginning of the 80s, it was a period where African countries of this franc area had a very strong economical crisis due to the plummet of the price of the raw materials. They were lacking of currency, and at this moment, France should have played its role and give loans in CFA, and it decided with the IFM, which pressured also, and they eventually decided to devaluate of 50% the CFA franc, and this decision was taken without the agreement of the African governments. They protested, they tried to to impede it, but they did not manage. Second period, quite recently, where Central African countries of Franc area had issues, financial issues. Their operation accounts were threatened not to have currency anymore. So France should have given loans. And once again, it called to the IFM not to give money. And in exchange, the IFM implemented several conditions to have this loan, and France stepped back and did not honor its promise, its guarantee. And last year, once again, we had several debates in the French National Assembly about the CFA franc. And I think it was one deputy that explained about the CFA that they hoped that this guarantee would never be actioned. But it is something that very well assumed by the French, is they keep saying that it is important that France is still be here within the system to play this role of guarantee that we consider is a real scam.
Donc, là, on en vient à la
So
question.
here we saw on these questions, who are the beneficiaries? Of course, they are. So we wrote our book. It's not at random, it's because in Africa, at least, all the former colonial monetary bloc were dismantled. And if we still have some, they're working today in a different way. So why do we still have this system? It's because it is creating winners, beneficiaries. And these people are the French companies and the French government. How? Well, the first thing is that France can pay its imports in this area in its own currency. So we understand why it is important to pay your import in your own currency. You do not need to have foreign currency to have any exchange at the international level. We saw the consequences, for example, for when Russia wanted to get its oil and gas paid in rubles. So here for France, they have this privilege. France has this privilege regarding its former colonies. They pay their imports, the services and goods in its own currency. So they do not need to have dollars or any way. It can, though, saves its own reserves. And it was very useful at the time of the franc because it was a rather weak currency. So the objective was to support the rate of its currency. Other advantage is that they have commercial surplus regarding the CFA countries, and this is important because it is due to the fact that it is a colonial heritage. There is a strong presence of French companies in these countries, and all of this makes that the exchanges are very strong in these countries, and we still have this business relationship with France. So French companies also benefit from a huge market, a stable market. And the other thing is that these companies are sure that they can take all their benefits, all their capitals freely without any transfer, without any conversion. They will always have enough money to convert with a fixed rate change. They won't have any risk of change. The system is done for those who have to repatriate their benefits and their capitals, can do it without any devaluation of the CFA. All this system was also condemned by a report done in 1917 by the French Economic Council. This system also allowed France to use their change reserves deposited in the French Treasury to manage the debt in France, saying that France, yes, it is a huge country, can go on the market, but still, when these reserves were here, France used it to reduce its own debt. Another thing is that we have more beneficiaries, for example, in Africa. These are the middle and wealthy classes in Africa. Actually, the CFA franc is a money that was over-evaluated. I said earlier that in 1948, one CFA was equal to 2 francs, and it was the case until 1994. It was the only time when the CFA was reduced regarding the French franc. So this currency allow people to import easily. So if you go in the franc zone, for example, there is little local production. It's more for importation and exportation. And this is money for middle and wealthy classes. A colleague of mine studied this and say that the thing is that CFA franc is advantageous for 20% of the population. Another thing is that the CFA is not just an economic tool, it's a control or repression for France. It is a real threat for all the leaders, all the governments that are against France. Why? Because actually, when a leader in the country is against Paris, Paris can ask to the central bank to restrict this government to have access to its own account, to the own change account, and cut it to its own monetary system. It was done in 2011 in Côte d'Ivoire when there were electoral crisis between Laurent Gbagbo, which was the former president, and his rival Alassane Ouattara, and France was in favor of Alassane Ouattara, so they decided to cut money to the government of Côte d'Ivoire at the time. Same thing in Mali. There was a coup, a military coup, when the military were not against France, but some were against France. So once again, they cut access to their accounts at the central bank, cut access to their reserves of change. So now today, the government in Mali is cut from its own domestic financial system. So CFA franc is actually a tool that can be used to put pressure on political leaders. And this is why in general, we can see that there is no leaders that is criticizing this system. So on this system allow France to be a huge power at the political level, but also economical on the international stage. But it's not a real power, actually. This is thanks to this monetary empire.
Next slide, please.
Next slide, please. There is also some advantages for the economies that use the CFA system. First one is that the exchange rate is way too rigid. Here, for example, we have a double monetary union. When you are in a monetary union where the countries are related one to each other with a fixed exchange rate, it's okay. But here the problem is we are related to another regions, the Eurozone. So the thing is that here you do not have possibility to use this exchange rate to adapt in case of economic shock and political shock. There were a lot in the CFA Franc countries. So when you decide this system, when you are facing important shocks, the only way to react is internal devaluation. So if you cannot use exchange rates, you have to reduce the public expenses to reduce the investment, the consumption of households. It's your only way to react. Second thing, if we can have this system of a fixed exchange rate, the question is, why should we adapt the CFA to euro? For example, in Central Africa, the majority of the countries are petrol exporters. So why should we adapt our money to you? Because that would be, for example, to fix it to the dollar. So in any cases, since euro is a strong currency regarding dollar, and dollar is the money, the currency where we have exports, it is creating a problem, a structural problem when we have, which is in favor of importation and not in favor of exportation. So all other countries have deficit, chronic deficit. Second part is to have this system the central bank does not favor the credit at national level, and the banks are not interested in production. They only work at the colonial, like they did at the colonial time, is to finance activities, quick activities, short-term activities, for example, services and all. There is no finance for agriculture, industries, etc. Every time when we try to invest in this type of activities, we have very high rates. So it's another problem of this system. There is also the problem of freedom of transfer. And for CFA, we have huge transfer with foreign countries. We gave figures in our book, for example, for countries like Cameroon, Côte d'Ivoire, which are very weakened by this system. So for the 14 countries that are using CFA, 9 are classified as the least developed countries in the world. So all these countries actually are economically specialized, like it was at the colonial era. They all produce raw material, they all export raw material and import everything that has a added value. There is no more local production in the country, and it's all related to the CFA system. Next slide, please. Here, actually, you have a table that shows the stagnation or the decline on long term of all the countries that use CFA franc. For example, Côte d'Ivoire, it's the strongest economy talking country. In 1978, the GDP was 3,330 US dollar per person. And you can see the difference within the years, though actually Côte d'Ivoire was a lot richer 40 years ago. And you see the same tendency for all the countries like Niger, Guinea-Bissau, etc. Also in Central Africa, you have the same tendency. So all countries belonging to the CFA area, every time either they stagnate, either they lived a decline. Next slide, please. I think it's up to you, Fanny. Yes, the great question is why 55 years after the implementation of the CFA, with all these problems for the people, like the countries that use this, how is it still implemented? Why the African leaders do not question it, do not try to get rid of it? So this is one of the major countries that we have with this system. Ndongo talked a bit about it. It's because this CFA system in itself is repressive. One of the first reasons that no leader to question it is because France still has a strong influence on the selection of the elite in these countries, political elite in this area, which allow it to place its to place leaders that are in favor in France. I talked about the power it still had during the time these countries became independent, but it's still the case today. And when the elections have results that do not please France, France implements military operations to take advantage, which we saw in Côte d'Ivoire quite recently. So this is why all the governments are in favor of France. They won't question CFA Franc. And for those who dare to question it, they hesitate, they are reluctant because they are afraid. They are afraid of reprisal because France showed that it was capable to punish any leader that would be against this system. Everything started, this reprisal system started in 1958 in Guinea. And in 1958, Guinea decided to be independent following a referendum. So Guinea tried to be independent when the other countries remained colonies. And Guinea decided to create its own money, its own currency. France did not like it, did not want it to happen, did not want to see the birth of this new currency, and did not want the other colonies to have the same idea. So it launched, French authority launched reprisal operations against Guinea, against its president, Sékou Touré. They were replaced by people. There were also monetary reprisal that are very perverse reprisal, because the Secret Service of France created false money to put it into the market of Guinea, which is, as you guess, created inflation. It was a huge negative consequence for the local economy. Same thing in 1963, Sylvanus Olympio, the president of Togo, was assassinated in January 1963 when its country wanted to create a national currency. So there were huge suspicions on French involvement. If we still don't know what happens, but we are mainly focusing on the French authorities for this assassination. So there could be a huge list of all French reprisal for all people against CFA Franc. We can remember two main moments in history when some African leaders question or criticized or demand to reform the system. The first one in the 70s, when Sylvanus Olympio was assassinated, but also at the beginning of the 70s, some leaders, African leaders, asked to change a bit the system, and under pressure of its leader, France accepted to relax and except for the central banks, two central banks of franc area that were still related to Paris at the time. So France accepted for these banks to be situated in Africa, is Senegal and Cameroon, and for the people working in these banks would be African inhabitants and not French inhabitants. I think the whole history of Franc area, only two countries managed to get rid of the system, Mauritania and Madagascar in 1973. Still today, this system remains with huge reprisal. We saw it in 2011 in Ivory Coast for this electoral crisis between Laurent Gbagbo and Alassane Ouattara. Alassane Ouattara was supported by the French president Nicolas Sarkozy, who really wanted him to be president, and everything was done in France on the financial monetary aspect to block Côte d'Ivoire and to be sure that Laurent Gbagbo loses power when he was recognized as elected by the Ivorian administration. It was only in 2011 France blocked its operational account to block any activity of Côte d'Ivoire. They also closed some banks, French banks in Côte d'Ivoire, etc. They implemented everything to not to allow Côte d'Ivoire to function. And we saw that same thing in Mali in the following months. One small change since years, we have an increasing pressure on French authorities. It's no more the African leaders, like in the 70s, that have this contestation. We have a civil society organization that makes demonstration, conferences, that they ask to end the CFA franc using arguments that were presented by Ndongo. It is a major problem in on the economical aspect or in terms of sovereignty too. And this contestation is even more important and even more a problem for French authorities. It's because we also have a contestation of the military presence of France in the Sahel. We had 6,000 French military in the Sahel and multiple military bases. So today we are in a context with a lot of contestation, demonstration, opposition, with a civil society and organizations that express themselves a lot more and more against this. Another change is that we have political opponents today that criticize the CFA franc. For example, in Côte d'Ivoire, we have Mamadou Koulibaly, who was finance ministry. Also in Senegal, we have the main opponent to the actual president, Ousmane Sonko. And in several times, he criticized the CFA franc. And against this contestation, France had to react. At the beginning, it was just turning a blind eye, looking down on these young Senegalese demonstrating against the CFA. And eventually, France had a speech which was the same it always had, saying that France is not actually the master of the CFA. They're just here to, let's say, humanitarian reasons to help the countries of the CFA area. They're here to guarantee the money, the currency, but this speech does not work anymore. It did not convince, so France had to evolve, to change its speech. And in December 2019, Emmanuel Macron went in Côte d'Ivoire. It was a huge surprise because it was not announced, not explained to anyone. He announced with the president of Côte d'Ivoire, Alassane Ouattara, both announced that there would be a reform of the CFA franc, but only for Western Africa CFA. They say it would be the end of CFA. So all the medias, French medias, American medias announced that indeed that would be the end of the CFA franc. That's what a lot of people remembered, that the CFA died in December 2019, but it's not the case. If not, we wouldn't be here. So the France actually just reported some changes that Ndongo talked about. So actually the Western Africa Central Bank does not have the obligation to make a deposit of 50% of its benefits to the French Treasury. There is no more French representative in its institutions, and that's it. And France said, okay, it's over. You can see that the CFA is dead, but actually it's not. Because France actually implemented new rules for France to still have control actually on what is happening, and is following every day the reserves, the rates, always with this argument of guarantee, because they still have this power of guarantee. Another aspect we have to mention is that France announced that CFA would be renamed, at least that we will create another currency, ECO. But ECO was chosen by another group of countries, the Economic and Monetary Community of Western Africa, with 15 countries, including the CFA countries. So these 8 countries plus a few more. So they all had a project of unique currency, ECO. And when France announced the end of CFA and the creation of ECO, actually there were implemented an operation to try to undermine this new unique currency, ECO, that would have been implemented. So actually what French authority did is where to confuse the new announcement of this new currency. And we saw that the real project of France, it never said openly, of course, was not to end the CFA, can be in Western Africa or in Central Africa, but to enhance it, to get it wider. France would like Ghana, for example, to join the CFA area, and other countries of West Africa. And stop on this topic. I think that we'll go now. We talk about the future and the possibilities to get rid of a CFA. So we have a few alternatives regarding the CFA franc. We have 4 ways to get out of this system. First one, what we call the symbolic reformism. It aims to maintain the franc zone as it is with these pillars, but the idea would be just to remove all the annoying symbols. This was the spirit of the reform announced in 2017, announced by Emmanuel Macron. And like explained Fanny, they say that they closed the operation account, and the French representative would get out of the banks. But actually, we say that this representative are getting out by the door, but coming back by the window. So there is no huge change. It's just some makeup, just an administrative reform. Second way, what we would call the adaptive reformism. So we see that the African countries have more and more exchanges with other countries like China, have more and more exchanges with each other in Africa. So actually the CFA is a problem for African competitivity. So some people say, okay, so why not trying to find another way, another change system? Some African economists have this type of reform, but the problem is that France will never accept for this country to use another currency. Why? Because this guarantee of convertibility can be only offered in its own currency, euro. It will never provide a guarantee in dollar or in any other currency. So this way is also a dead end. Third way, that would be to create a wider CFA franc area, for example, a regional currency. For example, the Economic Community of Western African States with 15 countries, 8 which are part of the CFA franc, have a project since 1983 to create a regional currency, but this project was not launched yet. We have a lot of reports, but it was postponed to 2017. So I don't think that would be an alternative because actually it's just a copy-paste of the Eurozone with all the default we know of Eurozone. So that would be a real emancipation of the countries. It would be more an integration. Because it is created by a neoliberal system. Anyway, the countries that use CFA franc themselves are not ready yet to use these regional currencies. They prefer to be in a system with friends than with their English-speaking neighbors like Ghana, etc. And since our roadmap is a copy-paste of the Eurozone with the Maastricht conference and treaties, so actually these countries are not very stable. So for all the criteria to get into this regional currency would not be accepted for these countries. So this third way is also a dead end. Last one, fourth one. Next slide, please. So this is what we call the national currencies, solidary national currencies. This is an option that was proposed by several African economists. So the idea would be to have monetary cooperation, not an integration with a unique currency, but a cooperation, meaning that each country has its own national currency with each national bank, and the exchange rates of each country should be established case by case, individually. So maybe that would be, we could have a mechanism of common exchange rate. We could create an African system of payment, and also we could think about common political or laws and laws about alimentation and food, because we spend a lot on food and energy, and all these countries have a huge workforce in agriculture. In Nigeria, we have countries that export a lot of food, so that would be the last alternative. But for now, we do not have many people that are in favor of this solution. So for now, the future of CFI will be determined by all these social struggles, because the good news is that there are more and more people and voices against the system, saying that we have to put an end to the CFI system. There are a lot more political that say that it's possible to have prosperity with this system and impossible to have political independence. And I think that we can see the same thing all around the world with the sanctions imposed by European countries to other countries they are not in agreement with. I think that more and more people realize that it is important to be financially autonomous. I will end here. Thank you, and I hope you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Fanny. Thank you, Ndongo. That was very, very informative and a rich amount of information. I'm sure there are going to be questions coming in from the participants, but I just wonder if I can pose one question to you to start with. You've outlined the potential alternatives that are on the table. But it strikes me, some might criticize your final proposition of these alternatives as technical solutions to a political problem. And I think this is the issue of what is the role of people? What's the role of movements in developing the conditions upon which alternative mechanisms can be posed? Because it seems to me that otherwise it does become an abstract technical solution. Let me pose that to you both.
So technical option and the feasibility depends of the nature of the presence, the forces present on territory. There is an economist that works on the franc, and when I was talking to him about the national devices, he says, no, it doesn't work because it doesn't go into the Pan-Africanism. But in Mali, it stands into a colonial system. And the government says we need to cut off the government from Mali, from this monetary system. So what should we do? Mali doesn't have support from the other states, but have the support of the population. But the population doesn't make the law. So it's not possible to go straight to a national monetary system. And this economist I was talking about told me it's not the best option, like technical option from his point of view, but it's the reality now that we need to implement if we want to have this independence, economical independence. So it has to have its own monetary system. In another context, more favorable in Pan-Africanism and stuff like that, maybe we can think about regional monetary system and stuff like that. But this feasibility depends on the states, on each government. I can say what I prefer, maybe. It's a monetary system and regional and not unique, but the forces are different. We don't decide at an individual level. But we need to see all the different possibilities we have on the table. I would just add, I like to talk about the example of Madagascar. In 1973, it went out of the system of the CFA monetary system. And how it happened, it was a really strategic and historical point, because it was a strong power of neo-colonialism strength, and it was overthrown by the revolution, the popular revolution, by the workers, the campesinos, the land workers. And there was this military group that took over this revolution and support the president. And their objective was to put an end about the agreements, economic agreements with France, and also to obtain that Madagascar could go out of this system. And the military presence there was with the population, was supporting the population rebellion. So the military minister of the military system, he was leading this operation. And he was saying his objective was ending the military French system and this presence of France in their land. And France did accept that. But the president at the time, Pompidou, he thought about Madagascar was not such a economical force for France, so he wasn't so concerned about the fact that Madagascar wanted to go out of this system. There's many elements now there that was playing a role in this situation, but there is this legitimate popular force here that it's important to highlight.
One is we have read some of Prophet Samir Amin's writings. Could the two of you elaborate his proposal on currency reform for Africa? Do you share his views, and what are the main criticisms of his views? The second question is, how would the ECOWAS project of creating a single regional currency avoid some of the problems encountered by the countries of the Eurozone? The third question, what are the positions of the powerful non-Francophone countries, such as Nigeria and South Africa, regarding a possible regional currency? How might they benefit? Is there a marked difference in the currency sovereignty between Anglophone and Francophone countries in Africa? Are the non-Francophone countries in Africa under the US hegemony, so that it's a question of a lesser evil for France or the USA? Is there any resistance coming from within military and political repression, so that we can be, so what can be done to promote the people's cause? And everyone's expressing lots of thanks for a very illuminating presentation. And finally, there's one on the issue about, to what extent was Gaddafi's proposition for Libya the cause of his downfall, and why do you stress solidarity, referring to national currencies as an alternative? How would solidarity make a difference? Lots of questions, and I just suggest you pick one or two that may be of interest for you to respond to, as we are quite short of time.
Ok, en fait, par rapport à la réforme de Samir Amin,
about the reform of Samir Amin, I did write an article on it. I agree with this reform. It seems to me it's the most realistic reform for the political forces. It's a reform that could create the condition to integrate their economical system for each country. Because you cannot have a national political level if you don't have any national monetary devices. Maybe we can have a union of monetary devices regional at the regional level, but each country needs to have its own device and monetary system. We can have a monetary system, a national monetary system, but that collaborate between different countries of the zone. We can have different ways of managing this monetary system between the countries, and that could help to help the development of these countries at a local level, because all these countries are considered as the most underdeveloped countries actually in the world. But the only problem, we already talked about this with Firoze, is it the political level ready to make an effort to create these conditions? Pan-Africanism says that we need a unity in Africa. The problem, the Eurozone doesn't work. It wasn't made for the European population. It was created to put the government for the benefits of the finance superiority of the population. The same disciplinarity of neoliberalism was thought to help the same 20% of the richest. So even though it brings some benefits in Europe, it's not the case in Africa. So this unique device, we also need to have this government, this federal government that can afford this guarantee for the poorest, for the whole population. And without sanction, without at the name of Pan-Africanism, without penalty, no? All this system has to implement without this penalty from Europe. We are in a mondial, whole worldwide system. It means that when you have profits, commercial profits at a level, international level, in New York, for example, we can take you out the dollar from you. And
disons, la valeur, en fait, pour ne pas laisser ça, disons, aux États-Unis, pour rester dans le système dollar. Et donc, lui, il avait un projet de monnaie unique continentale basé sur ce qu'ils ont appelé le dinar gold, dinar or. Et donc, ça, c'est un projet. On peut en discuter, est-ce que c'est la bonne voie, etc. Mais au moins, il avait compris de manière précoce que, bon, quand vous accumulez des dollars, en fait, c'est que, bon, vous ne maîtrisez pas ce que vous accumulez. C'est-à-dire qu'à tout moment, on peut vous priver de ça. Et ça, il avait compris. Et maintenant, les gens se rendent compte que quand on est dans un système de monnaie fiduciaire, bon, il peut être très dangereux d'accumuler des réserves de change dans la devise d'autres pays.
It can be very dangerous to accumulate money in a currency in which you can have sanctions. So this is what we can say in general, but there is very little solidarity in Africa because, for example, Senegal went in Libya to say to Gaddafi to say that he need to have the access to power. South Africa was a bit solidar, but in general, we do not see any solidarity, not yet active, at least.
Final de Fanny.
Last comment, Fanny.
A few words.
Non, enfin, je pense qu'on est dans.
No, I think that we could talk a lot, but we do not have time. I think that we are in a important moment. I think that a lot of things will happen, at least for sovereignty, currency sovereignty of African country. We can see that today in France, they are trying to gain time, but eventually they will lose. France will have problems itself, having economical problems. It won't managed to keep its power.
A really warm thanks to you. I'm very, very grateful to you for stimulating the discussions here. I would like to invite you to stay on to engage with the discussion with Zikode. With great honor to have Zikode join us today. Some of you may know that the vast shanty towns spread across Durban have recently been devastated by flooding. People's homes have been destroyed, their possessions lost, and many have died. The death toll is still mounting and many people are still missing. And the scale of the disaster is unprecedented, it's staggering, and has left the city and its people in a terrible state. In the aftermath of the floods, Abahlali Bas Mondolo, the shack dwellers movement, comprising more than 100,000 members, are all frenetically busy. But its visionary leader, Zikode, a man in the eye of the storm, has agreed to give us some time to discuss both the struggles of the Abahlali Bas Mondolo shack dwellers movement, of which he is the president and founder, and it is the largest social movement in post-apartheid South Africa. And in 2009, it won the historic Constitutional Court case victory that defended the poor and popular democracy. Zikode is the Swedish government's global winner of the Per Anger Prize for 2021. So it's a real honor to have you with us, Bru. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Program Director, Comrade Firoze, for this wonderful opportunity. I just want to say that we appreciate as Abahlali that you have given us this invitation to share some of the experiences that we Abahlali have drawn from more than 16 years of our struggle. And it is much appreciated that we are sharing these experiences right here with you all. Now, I just want to take this opportunity to thank the following co-organizers of this series of discussion: the Global University for Sustainability, CCRD-CS, Lingnan University, Daraja Press, and Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives. Abahlali Basemjondolo is a grassroots movement of the shack dwellers and the impoverished in South Africa. The name itself translates to residents of the shacks. The movement was formed in 2005 to fight for, protect, promote, and advance the interests and the dignity of the shack dwellers and the impoverished. May I firstly share the sad news that Comrade Firoze has alluded to, that in KwaZulu-Natal, particularly here in Durban, where we are mostly based, there has been a heavy rain last week, and floods have resulted in loss of property, infrastructure, and many lives. About 446 people have been confirmed to have lost their lives, while over 60 people are still missing and are continuously being searched by communities and various emergency rescue units. May their soul rest in peace. It is very important to understand the living conditions in the shack settlements. Some of you would mostly use the word slums, which is very problematic for those of us who are living in these shanty towns, who may not have been in these. It is important for those of you who may not have been in these conditions to really understand. There is hardly any access to water and sanitation. There are no road access, no refuse collection, and there's no electricity. As a result, people would use and are forced to use candles as a source of light. They would use paraffin stoves to cook. Both candles and paraffin stoves have caused serious threats to lives of shack dwellers, causing shack fires which have taken lives of hundreds of people. Because shacks are too close to one another, it means one shack is on fire, then the entire community is on fire and people get killed. So lives have been lost in these shanty towns. Since Abahlali focus on our struggles on land, decent housing, and human dignity, the starting point of this discussion must be that access to land has been denied to the majority of Black people in South Africa. Discussing land without discussing justice will be unjust. To take justice seriously, we must take seriously that women have the same right to land as men, and that impoverished people must not be marginalized in this process. Discussing land without discussing impoverishment will also be unjust. Land is a rural and urban question. It is also a question of food sovereignty and housing. It is a question of dignity. It will ultimately become a question of revolutionary democracy. The statistics tells us that there is a housing backlog of about 2.1 million in South Africa. The crisis in the cities is urgent. This crisis cannot be resolved without making well-located land available for housing. Land reform cannot, therefore, only be understood as a question of land for farming. Our belief is that land is a precious gift from God. So land is to be shared equally amongst all creatures, including human beings. Land should produce foods. We should live on it in peace and in harmony. We should build houses and so on. It is to be loved and taken care of. There should be no institution or individual that can claim superpower over land. Not the anti-land invasion unit, not the red ants, not capitalism or the ruling party. Only the people from below, democratically organized, have the right to decide on the future of land use and ownership. Abahlali have always warned that the social value of land must come before its commercial value, and not vis-a-vis. We have always warned that South Africa must belong to all who live in it, and those politicians must not be allowed to divide people according to where they were born or which language they speak. If you are impoverished and Black in South Africa and from around the world, your humanity or your human rights are taken as a joke. Freedom is fake. You can be slandered, beaten, tortured, and killed with impunity. The same Black-led government that is talking about expropriation or expropriating land without compensation has squeezed us into tiny plots of land. We are placed in tin, broken houses far out of the cities. Some of us remain locked in transit camps as if we are not human beings. In shacks, we must live with fires, mud, and rats. We share one shack as big families. We sleep with our grown-up kids without privacy. When we occupy land to build our own future and to help our government restore dignity to the dispossessed and marginalized, we face brutal evictions. What is so sad is that government has no clear plan for our housing challenges, but they have a very clear and detailed plan on how the land invasion units should destroy our only hopes of homes. They can easily destroy our homes, but cannot build us homes. In eThekwini, we are serving life sentence in the shacks after its former senior officials made it clear to us that as long as his party is in charge of government, abahlali or the shack dwellers will not benefit anything from this government. He accuses abahlali of running our own authority and of being founded by foreign agencies who seeks to destabilize our hard-won democracy. When they say that, they use it to justify violence and killing of activists. We have lost at least 21 activists who were assassinated since 2009. So the struggle of abahlali has been paid in blood. We are still oppressed. We know that the government will continue to oppress us as they seek our votes by talking about land. We know that if there is land reform, it will not be for us. There is no clear plan for impoverished people in rural areas and cities. Our migration to the cities in search of the better future promised by our constitutional democracy has been brutally criminalized. This problem can only be solved when the poor, who do not count in our society, begin to count. We will only begin to count when we build our own democratic power from below. The government has no plan for us to access well-located urban land. Therefore, the landless have no choice but to continue to occupy vacant and unused land, to connect ourselves to basic services such as water and electricity. This is how those who have vast amount of land will learn to share with the landless. Our choices are very limited when our efforts of building the power of the impoverished is reduced to criminality. Our choice to prevent housing corruption is turned into assassination. When councillors are threatened by our art of organizing, they end up killing us. Our choice has been to organize ourselves and to build the power of the impoverished from below. And yes, our choice has been to occupy unused and vacant land, but we have paid an ultimate price for that. But we are determined to rise above the politics of expropriation of land without compensation to benefit few Black elites, while the Black majority remain in deep poverty. The occupation of vacant and unused land has worked for us and will continue to work as long as the government has no proper planning for rural communities and for us in poor urban settlements. The expropriation of land from below will continue, and we will continue to resist any attempts that seeks to silence or co-opt our movement. In waging our struggle, we have used 3 strategies and tactics that I want to share. First one being the people's power, which is used by poor people, which is the power of the oppressed from below. This involves organizing and educating the masses through popular education and other methods. It involves building solidarity between and within struggling communities. The second one will be the use of media to tell the truth and expose injustices, inequalities, and corruption. The media can be a very powerful tool for progressive strugglers. We have seen it in our own experiences. The third strategy would be litigation, courts, the laws. This form of strategy becomes our last resort since it is not our terrain. Access to lawyers and court can be very expensive for grassroots struggles. Hence, it becomes our last resort. Although courts and laws are not always in favor, it becomes our duties as well to create new laws that advances the cause of the oppressed and the marginalized. Abahlali have won many victories that we have celebrated. I would like to mention just the three amongst many victories, despite the difficulties and challenges that our movement continues to face. One is that we have successfully kept thousands of families on their occupied land and homes, who would otherwise have been evicted illegally by the state organs, such as your municipalities, land inversion units, or even by the private landlords. The second victory is that we have successfully challenged some of the regressive policies and legislation, such as the then Slums Act, that would have legitimized evictions of the impoverished communities and criminalized poverty. This was one of the pieces of legislation that was introduced in 2007 when South Africa was announced to hosting the FIFA World Cup in 2010. So South Africa was trying to build what they called world-class cities, which is, in their interpretation, is cities without slums, cities without poverty, cities that are designed for the elites. And of course, through this regressive legislation, which became known as the Slums Act, was imposed on the impoverished communities as a way to hide poverty from the international communities who were descending to South Africa for the FIFA World Cup in 2010. And of course, Abahlali challenged the Slums Act in streets and in courts, to an extent that we took the Slums Act challenge to the highest court of our land, the Constitutional Court in Johannesburg, and we won. And that was a big slap on the face of the governing party, the African National Congress. And for that, we paid a huge price when many of our homes and leaders were destroyed by an armed mob that was associated with the ruling party. And the question was, who the hell are you, dirty folks, to take the government to court? That was the highlight of the strength of the impoverished communities that are taken for granted. The last victory, which is the third one that I wanted to share, is that we have built a sustained and a strong movement and remained a people's movement and hope. Building this movement has not been easy. We have faced various challenges that aimed at destroying the very voice that was emerging. And the repression that we faced was not only coming from the state, but it came from various sectors of our society. It came from the media, it came from NGOs and from the academia, people who were opposed to the idea that poor people can think for themselves. We have had a situation where we've been attacked for thinking for ourselves. Some NGOs and some academics thought that it was their duty to think for the poor and to speak for them, to represent them, and to actually take decision on their behalf. So when we rejected the idea that poor people cannot think for themselves, the movement was under attack from various sectors of our society. So we had to fight very hard to maintain that poor people can think for themselves. So in dealing with the issues that Abahlali are facing, it is very important to say, as much as we have had this number of victories that Abahlali have been able to achieve over the years, challenges were enormous and continue to be very difficult for the movement, particularly the repression that continues to terrorize our movement and our communities. I have mentioned already that the movement has lost at least 21 activists between 2009 up until today, with the recent killing of 2 comrades last month on the 8th of March, where one of our leading leader in one of our occupation in Ekanana was shot to death in a broad daylight in the settlement. And within the space of 3 days, another one who was allegedly shot by the police, who came in the settlement, in a Ghanaian settlement to raid, was actually confirmed death after the alleged police raid felt that they should not arrest Mangale, who was shot, and they decided to shoot him. So we are facing this, and it becomes normal that activists can be killed with impunity. It is unfortunately that the killers of Mangale remains at large. And of course, there are various ways and initiatives that are being undertaken to bring the perpetrators to book, which involves the police, obviously, who were masked on the day. The police were masked. You could not see their faces. They were in uniform, but their vehicles were also, the number plate of their vehicles were also removed. So it was really difficult to understand whether one was really facing the police raid or it was the organized gang that was really attacking the settlements. In the case of Ayanda, who was also shot in a broad daylight by 4 gunmen, whom, by the way, 2 of them are well known in the community. It took time for the police to arrive in the settlement, and there was no patrol to provide security and protection to the community. The same gunmen were seen in the community a couple of days after the killing, and the community continued to be terrified as this incident happened in the full watch of the community, which included women and children who were actually witnessing the murder of Ayanda Ngila. And those women and children remained traumatized by this incident. And at that point, the government is nowhere to be seen. The police are not where to be seen. And this is very sad, because one would expect the police to be providing protection to the community, or at least patrolling and be visible in the community during this difficult moment. But it was clear that there seems to have been an instruction from above to say let these dirty people rot. Disconnection. Well, I was just saying the killing of Fabahlali is very disturbing, because it creates that the killing of activists should be normalized and it should be accepted in the society. And it's very disturbing, especially when parts of the society is silent about the killing of people. It cannot be accepted, it cannot be normal. I think there isn't enough noise to actually speak against state repression, to speak against the killing of activists, not just the sharp rulers activists. Here in this country, particularly in this province in KwaZulu-Natal, there is so much of killing, not only of activists, but politicians are facing the very daily brutal killing. Traditional leadership, your kings, your chiefs, and headmen, Izinduna, are also assassinated. So it has become a normal culture that is becoming acceptable in the society. And this is really disturbing, that killing would just be normalized in the country that was once a home to its residents and to the global communities. So this is what we are confronted with as the organization. However, the movement continues to grow despite in the midst of all these state repression. Our membership has just exceeded 100,000, making Abahlali one of the biggest social movements to have emerged in post-apartheid South Africa. Now, as the movement grows, then it becomes a threat to power, it becomes a threat to the ruling party and to the ruling elites, that leaders and activists of the movement become stagnated. I have not seen such courage within the organization, because when people are killed, then the enemy wants to create fear and distrust amongst activists and within the organization. We know of organizations that have fallen apart when they were attacked in the manner, repressed in the manner that Abahlali is facing right now. But fortunately, the brave men and women of this movement have stood very firm in defending their right to the city, their right to land, their right to decent housing, their right to dignity. Because if you are Black and poor in this country and in many countries, your life counts for nothing. So we are saying lives of Black shack dwellers also matter. So the struggle of Abahlali is really about the question of land for indigenous people. It's about decent housing, that many people remain landless, they remain homeless in our constitutional democracy, a democracy that has promised the right to housing, the right to access to healthcare facilities, the right to free education, and the right to economic opportunities, which is enshrined in our famous document called the Freedom Charter in South Africa. So the did not receive in 1994. It became the freedom of the elites. It did not yet receive the freedom, the economic freedom for that matter. Of course, we have the political freedom, we can speak, but at a very high price. This is what we are confronted with as the organization. And of course, many grassroots formations in South Africa are facing serious repression that makes it almost impossible to organize in the face of the continuous repression and marginalization of the impoverished communities in this country. So it is important, therefore, to understand that life and conditions, the daily living conditions of the shack dwellers are very difficult. We are forced to do what is right. We are forced to make sure that the next generation has a better living conditions. So when we make noise, when we stand up for what is right, and we think we do this in the best interest of South Africa and many oppressed nations in this world. So it is important, therefore, to locate the Abahlali struggle as a struggle that many, many communities around the world are facing. Indigenous people are still struggling in many quarters of our world. So it is important, therefore, to draw some lessons from the resilience, from the courage that Abahlali have demonstrated over the years, knowing that it is not easy. We have paid this price. So in conclusion, I do want to, I would like to leave you with two quotes Obviously, one is from a French philosopher by the name of Frantz Fanon, who once said, each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it or betray it. Now, Abahlali is in that process and in that spirit of saying it is a moment of do or die, that we have discovered our mission. We have no reverse gear. We cannot go back. We cannot surrender. It is a do or die moment. We cannot then compromise the future of our children and for the next generation to live in a better world. That is why we think these words of Frantz Fanon are relevant. They encourage us. They actually send a message to those who may not have discovered their mission and to decide whether or not they want to fulfill or betray what they have discovered. The second quotes come from the founder of the Boy Scouts Association, Lord Baden-Powell, who once said, try to leave the earth a better place than you have found it. This is not easy when we are confronted with natural disaster, with the environmental issues that requires that we also pay respect to our nature, the Mother Earth. So again, Baden-Powell reminds us that we have a duty, we have an obligation, we have a duty to leave the earth a better place than we have found it. That is why, as Abahlali, again, we feel that we have an obligation, we have the responsibility not to keep quiet, not to fold our arms when we see human catastrophe, when people are suffering. Because right now we are not just confronted by the natural disaster, the floods that are facing us. We are being repressed and we are being assassinated. And we suffer the most. We are being evicted from our homes, from the very land, from the very Mother Earth that we ought to respect and to look after. So I think, therefore, these two quotes from these intellectuals are really relevant for me to leave you all with, to say it is important that we take our place in our society, take it humble but very firm for us to be able.
Comrade Spoo, thank you so much for a really excellent presentation. We have lots of questions coming in. There's some 2,100 viewers live on this seminar. Before I read out some of those questions very quickly, one of the things that struck me about the struggles of Abahlali over the last 20 years is what comes across is you are saying that shack dwellers, ordinary working poor, are not seen as legitimate citizens, not seen as legitimate part of the new South Africa. But we've also seen the rise once again of violence under the heading of xenophobia against people who are also not seen as to be human, to be part of South Africa. What do you see as a connection between these two aspects?
Yes, thanks, Comrade Firoze, for that question. We had to fight very hard for us to actually tell the world that we are also human beings, that we have brain, we can think. It's not only the state, unfortunately, that has that mentality that we have no brain. Some sectors of our society have that mentality as well. So as Abahlali, we had to really fight very hard for us to really gain that respect, that recognition that we are actually human beings. And we had to prove that. So the connection, therefore, with the idea that poor people cannot think for themselves and the level of violence that is directed at poor communities in particular tells a very painful story about our color, that we still have a long way to go. Because here in South Africa, it's been made very clear that if you are poor and living in shacks, already you are characterized as a criminal. You are already seen as a traitor. You are already seen as a troublemaker. You are already seen as a burden on our cities, on the city government in particular. So when people do not have decent homes and then they are living in shacks, the thinking is that when you come from your countryside, from the rural villages, you come to burden the city, you come to build a shack or a slum. No one comes to cities to live in shanty towns or to build cities. We all come to cities to be closer to job opportunities, to be closer to active economic areas, to have access to better education, to have better access to health facilities and so on. So the idea, therefore, that poor people cannot really think for themselves, someone else has to think for them and actually be paid to think for you, speak for you, and even take decisions on your behalf, is a dangerous politics. And it is, of course, related to the culture of violence and the xenophobia that has continued to tear apart South Africa. It is shame, it is disgrace that we continually witness incidents of violence against migrant communities, particularly against Black people, African people in this country. And people are taught violence. And when you are raised with violence, you are treated with violence. Obviously, this has been very clear here in South Africa. In July last year, there was this huge riots, what we call food riots, where people were really helping themselves, attacking factories, malls, and infrastructure. So again, the message was very clear. And then our articulation, obviously, to that is that when you are, it's just been very difficult to preach peace, unity, non-violence when the state is so violent, when people's homes are destroyed with violence, often at gunpoint, illegally when people are facing evictions. And therefore, you cannot therefore expect people to behave in a non-violent way. However, it is our continuous duties as part of our popular education that we become more humane and rise above the politics of violence. So violence is created. The violence that is directed to migrant communities is created. It is not our culture, it is anti-African in a way, but it continues here in South Africa, and there isn't much that the government is doing. Rather, progressive civil society and grassroots organizations are really taking the issue of violence very seriously. But the gender-based violence has become the culture. So we are becoming a nation of violence. So that is very problematic, and I think it is disparate, and it saves the interest of the elites, so that while they are stealing, while corruption happens, we are busy talking and sorting violence. When the country is being stolen away from us, when our land is being taken away, when our wealth is being dispossessed out of ordinary people. I think it's just one of the games to keep us busy fighting amongst ourselves while our wealth and our freedom is being taken away.
Thank you, Comrade Spoo. I find it extraordinary and really admirable that in the face of propaganda saying that migrants are taking away your job, taking away your land, taking away your resources, Abba Klali has been in the forefront of saying, no, people cannot be illegal. Only acts can be illegal. And I think that's an extraordinary position to have taken. We have lots of questions coming in from our Chinese audience. Let me try and summarize them quickly. Can you say something more about land reform or the lack of it since the end of apartheid? You know, there's been a lot of talk about land reform, and you know, have there been any significant ones? And similarly, you know, the whole issue of landlessness and land reform, these issues are common to South Africa as they are in Zimbabwe. So I wonder whether you may be able to comment on that. Another interesting question related to that, is it the same elites and landowners that control land and resources in South Africa before and after 1994? Was it a blunder of the African National Congress to focus only on the end of political apartheid, but not of economic apartheid? Another question also, how does your movement deal with the difficulties of the pandemic? We've learned that the landless rural workers movement in Brazil has the slogan, occupy, resist, produce. What's your response to that? And in 2009, your movement won a historical constitutional court case about the Slums Act. We'd like you to say more. And I think also to emphasize in response to that, the extent to which it's not a technical victory in the courts, but it's a function of the mobilization of people that have resulted in such victories. Over to you, Spoon.
Yes, thanks, Comrade Firoze, and participants with all those questions. I think they really enriches our discussions. Rather than me saying what I think is relevant, you want to hear, it's better one to engage on what becomes an interest to you. So on the question of land reforms, I think there has been a very blunder, should I say, somehow the African National Congress was actually robbed, and other parties, obviously, during the negotiations for our freedom in 1994. The settlement agreement was really about giving South Africans, particularly the Blacks, only the political freedom. And there was absolutely no economic freedom that was negotiated well in the best interest of the people of South Africa. So the political freedom without the economic freedom has made what South Africa is today. We remain poor, but still think that we are free. The levels of poverty, inequalities, and the high rate of unemployment talks direct to that question that what we actually won in 1994 was the right to speak freely. But what does that mean? How does it translate when one does not have access to the economic freedom? Therefore, it is that reason that Abahlali was formed in 2005. Remember, what really made us to really stand up was that the promise of land was reduced to, was turned actually to give to the elites, to people that had money. There was a piece of land that was promised to the resident of Kennedy Road to build homes for them. But instead of giving that land to people to build homes for social need, business interests, profit was put before the truth. And lies were put before the truth. So the question of land remains a huge crisis in South Africa, because we understand that without the economic freedom and we continue to be dispossessed of our land, there's legally progress that we can make economically. So there has been proposal that land should be expropriated without compensation. So there has been a debate, and the bill that was brought before Parliament and for us as public to make comments on the expropriation of land without compensation, meaning that land should be taken away from those who stole it and be given to those who were dispossessed of their land. So obviously, it's an interesting debate that the majority governing party agreed to the expropriation of land without compensation. Opposition parties, and one of the biggest parties, also the economic freedom fighters, agreed. So there was this agreement between the ruling party and some parties that this legislation should be passed. But unfortunately, it hasn't been passed. Now, that it tells you a very big story. Whether or not we own our own land, it doesn't look like South Africa owns its own land. Even the head of state is not really clear on the question of land. It doesn't seem that he has total control over the land of South Africa. And therefore, we are squeezed into slums, into shanty towns today, because the question of land is being ignored deliberately, because it does seem that the land is not owned by South Africans or owned here in South Africa. It looks like someone from outside the country has control over our land and over our head of state, for instance. So we are in really dark, which is why what we have thought as a grassroots organization, what will assist us while the discussion and debates happens in parliament and in high places, what we are going to do on the ground is to occupy vacant and unused land and use it. That is why our principle has remained that social value of land must come before its commercial value. In other words, profit cannot come first. Social needs of land should come first before making profits. So we agree with the landless peoples in Brazil, the MST, that we are going to occupy land, we're going to resist, and we're going to develop land. And it's part of our strategy. And this is what we do every day. And it becomes an organizing tool. But when we have done that, I can tell you thousands of families have what they call homes today. We have not just occupied land, but we have worked hard to defend those land. We have not only built what we call homes for our children, we went beyond that, like in a Kenana commune, we have built community gardens. We have done farming. We have done poetry. We've built political schools to make use of land productivity, not just about building structures. Now, that should be supported by governments in the country where the high rate of unemployment has reached a very scary positions where more than 40% of people remain unemployed in this country. So this is very scary. So we are making use of land while we are discussing laws. When they turn this into an academic abstract exercise, on the ground, we occupy land, we hold on to it. Not only occupy land, but we also connect ourselves to basic services such as water and electricity to make sure that there's lives and livelihood that continues to happen. And within, in that way, these are not just criminal activities. We occupy land as a political a stance to educate our government what the nation needs. Then laws can follow, because laws should be determined by the day-to-day thinking and praxis of ordinary people. Laws should not be made to oppose the behavior of the people. They should be made to regulate and to manage the day-to-day thinking of the people. So obviously, these are part of the activities that Abashali engages in. So on the question of the Slums Act, as I have alluded, the Slums Act was not just a piece of legislation that was aimed to control but destroy shacks, settlements in KwaZulu-Natal. But the Slums Act was really an attack. It was trying to criminalize, to legitimize criminalization of impoverished communities, because the government has had a very clear plan as to how to destroy the shacks. Even the name itself, the Slums Act, it's very sad to hear even the language that is used. It was called KwaZulu-Natal Elimination and Eradication of Slums. Now it tells a story that in that shanty town, there is no human life. there is just a piece of trash that can be bulldozed. As you would have seen Operation Brumbagino in Zimbabwe, for instance, when villages were destroyed, bulldozed. All we are saying is that no matter how poorly built that structure, but there's a human being that ought to be respected, that ought to be treated with respect and dignity. That is how and why we had to oppose the Slums Act, to say we are dealing with human beings here. And the Slums Act also gave rise to the legitimizing of the transit camps. It means you would be relocated, removed from your own built shack into government built shack, what they call transit camps, which is basically an insult on any human being to be living in transit camps. So again, it doesn't differ from how the apartheid government treated Black people in South Africa. So we oppose that. So this victory was celebrated widely, not just by our members, but it was really a relief for many and thousands of shack dwellers in South Africa, because other provinces, other part of the country was also waiting to implement the Slums Act if it was going to succeed. So it was about to impress the international communities that was going to be coming for the FIFA World Cup in 2010, so that poverty can be hidden, so international communities cannot see poverty. So thanks to Abahlali, who together with our legal team from the Socio-Economic Right Institute, who really took these heavy tasks to prevent poor from arbitrary evictions.
Great, great. I mean, it's now 11:15 at night in China, and there are more than 2,300 people who are involved in this, and I wish we could go on all night, but I know that it's tough on the interpreters and tough on the organizers. I would have liked to have brought Ndongo Samba Sylla and Fanny Pigeaud into this conversation as well, but I think we are rather late and don't have that much time to do so. But I would like to express a very warm thanks to you, Comrade Spoo, to Ndongo, and to Fanny for really an incredibly stimulating talk. I'm only sorry that our time is so short, but it does suggest to me that further seminars need to be organized to take these issues much deeper and to give enough time for so many rich questions that have been coming in. To Kinchi Lau, to Jade, to all the translators doing such a fabulous job, to the organizers, all those involved in making this happen. Thank you so much. And we wish you well in your struggles, and a luta continua.